Hey everyone, welcome to the Beginner's Guide to Landscape Painting. I'm really glad that you're here. Now, if you're here, that means that you want to start this journey of landscape painting, don't quite know where to begin, so that is what we're here for. Now, I asked on Instagram what you guys wanted to learn when it comes to sort of beginning to paint landscapes. And there was a lot of answers, but they kind of came down to a very narrow range of things. And so we're going to talk about those. We're going to cover those. The first one is where to start. Where do you even start a landscape painting? How do we get mood in? Like what's that all about? Where is the detail? How to put detail and make sure there's not too much, make sure there's enough. There's a sort of a balance there, and how do we find that? Using reference, how do we use reference and not have it feel kind of stiff and stale, and then staying clear of the values. Some of you also wanted to paint some water, some clouds, some trees, so here we are. We're gonna paint through this, as well as maybe have some other little examples, and we're gonna do this in two parts. Here, just sort of working our way through some of this material, and then as we do this, if you have any questions, put them in the comments below. We're going to be doing a live Q&A where we're going to work through those questions as well as whatever kind of pops up at the time. Now, this is kind of all in preparation for my landscape painting course, which is starting very, very soon. So if this kind of whets your appetite, if you feel like you want to dive even further into all of these topics and really get confident in painting landscapes so they don't hold you back anymore. Yeah, we have that going. It's going to start soon, and I would love to see you there. So, yeah, so this reference was from our community over at Discord, and I just want to say thanks to Peter for sharing it with the group, and we're going to be using it because it's wonderful, especially when it comes to, you guys wanted water, clouds, and trees, so here we are. All right, so where to start? When it comes to landscape painting, it can be very intimidating, right? Because if I was standing here in person, looking out, there's literally hundreds and thousands of leaves and blades of grass, and there's just detail absolutely everywhere. Where do we even begin? And what we like to say is that productive complexity, like we all like complexity. We all want to think ourselves as being someone who can deal with lots of things, you know. But really, to make complexity work, productive complexity happens within the bounds of profound simplicity. And when it comes to a painting, we want simplicity first, and that will allow us to have complexity where we want it. So what we do is actually we kind of start in a very basic manner. We really want to find our basic shapes and go from there. So here's kind of like a little preparation that I did earlier. We're gonna sort of work our way through this. But even more than just simplicity, because you could cut it up in a variety of different ways. And the first thing we want to say is, if we're gonna break this down to something a little bit more simple, and then that will allow us to be more complex, we actually want to know, why do we want to paint this in the first place? And this answers every other question beyond, why do we want to paint this in the first place? And so for me, I really enjoy this here. Like, as I look at this, I see sort of the textures in the tree up here, the light hitting. That's what I want this painting to be about, right? And so since that's what I want this painting to be about, I can maybe be a little bit more loose everywhere else if I want to. And I want to make sure that at all points in time, this is where your eye goes, and this is where the interest is. And so I don't want to get too caught up in sort of working my way through these details here. Plus, if I do this, if I come here and want to try and get every single one of these little right, then I'm not going to end up anywhere kind of useful, and it's going to be forever before I can get to the things that I actually like. And so yeah, so what we want from the painting, which is basically the same as, why do I want to paint it in the first place? That's the first thing that we need to establish. Now, there are some other critical important things. Things like, where's the sun? We need to know that, right? Otherwise, we end up kind of flopping off, and it doesn't really matter if this is correct or not. So that's another thing about landscape painting, is I don't have to be technically correct about everything, but I do need to be internally consistent. So if this light feels like it's coming down from above like here, which it does, then I need to make sure that it feels that way throughout the whole thing. And if I would change that, that's also okay, so long as I'm changing it for the way that I'm treating the whole painting. So let's actually go ahead and just get started. Let's have a look. Here we go. I can actually move some of this stuff out of my way. And again, if you have questions in this process, please go ahead and ask. Put them in the comments below, and we're kind of going to get to them in our live Q&A. So this is where we're at. I've just kind of selected some of this to make it a little bit easier. And I'm going to break this into some of its very simple components. I did a little quick take before on just getting some of my colors right. Let's have a look at that, because we're just about to get into color. But what we want to look at is that inside of all of this in the background, right? These are some of the main colors I found in the sky. There's kind of this color up the top, color down the bottom. That means there's this kind of big gradient that goes up and down. That really helps us see that atmosphere. And then into that atmosphere, we have these clouds. And so we're playing around with kind of these three colors and values and get this big gradient coming down. In simplifying something, we want to see the big things that happen. We really do want to see the big things that happen because they help us to put everything else into context. So we're gonna have up in here some kind of nice big blue at the top. We don't want it to be too overwhelming, and I'm just using called medium brush, right? This is Procreate that we've got right going here. So I'm gonna put that down there, and then kind of get to a lighter and less saturated color coming in here. I think we go even lighter than that. Now, I don't want to get too caught up in getting this perfect, right? Our painting's already going to take us a significant amount of time, and especially for working our way through this here in a reasonable amount of time, we're just not going to get too caught up in it. Now, we want to have a look at these colors in here. Like we had seen before, everything kind of comes down into this similar kind of blue. And we might move a little bit to the side, but really they are very, very similar. When it comes to picking colors for a landscape, for anything really, we actually need to realize that some of it is, some qualities of color are going to be more useful for us than others. And especially if you haven't painted very much, this might be a little bit confusing, but I have something that I'm going to show you here in just a minute, which might help to kind of sort this out. Now we are going to be sort of going a little bit back and forth with some demonstrations. So right here, you can see I haven't put too much time and effort into it. Why is that? That's actually because, one, we're just taking it kind of simply right now. We're simplifying, and then later on we can get more complex. But two, our painting's not about this up here. It's not about that. And so we can come back to that later if we decide it's important. But first of all, we're kind of establishing relationships of everything. This is a hard part of simplifying, is stopping and then pulling everything together, so that then at that point we can decide, well, what's important for this painting, knowing that we have a thing we want from the painting, which for me is kind of working our way through this. Now, we were talking about picking and choosing colors and that some things are a little bit more important than others. Let's have a look at why I might choose to say that. So, I have an upside down sphere here. And this is fairly nice, right? It's a sphere, it's colored, it's got color. So when it comes to color, there's three qualities. Our hue, which is kind of what you would normally call color. That's kind of our rainbow that's right here. There's saturation, which is how colorful is that pot. So I might choose this color of yellow, but within that color of yellow, I can have it be less yellow and more yellow. That's a saturation. And then we have our value. That's our black and white quality. So it gets darker and gets lighter. So within these three things, what is the most important for communicating the vast depths of landscapes that we see? Color is very, very nice. And like one of my favorite early artists was David LaFell. He says, color gets all the credit, but value does all the work. We're gonna see what that means right here. So while we have this nice, beautiful, colorful ball, what happens if we get rid of the hue and saturation? So hue is, again, that's our this right here. If we pull down the saturation, so we're really just dealing with black and white, what happens? And the answer to that is not very much. We still get to see the shape of what it is we're talking about. We still get to see the object. What is this, and what 3D space does it take up? That's kind of still there. It might be a little less flavorful, a little less colorful, and we might want the color in there, but our black and white quality does a lot of the work for us. What happens, however, if we get rid of the value, that black and white quality, what happens if we get rid of that? And we just have the color. A lot of things disappear. We can't tell. We can still see the shape, but we can't tell what's happening in 3D space. And so that's really important. Let's go back to this up here, right? And so there might be a lot of color variations in here, but the most important thing we want is that black and white quality. Does it get dark? Does it get light? How dark and how light does it get? When we're establishing these big basic shapes, those are the questions that end up actually being really important to answer. And okay, so we're gonna continue on, remembering that we're kind of dealing with this blue here, over here. And now we're gonna pull in this back there. Now it's a little bit hazy, which is kind of a really nice quality to have. And so while we're doing this, we want to make sure that we're getting that black and white quality down. But we can be tablet's doing some weird things. We can be a little bit hazy if we want. There's a number of reasons that we can kind of do that here. But that is a conversation for another time. Sorry, just trying to get this to work. All right. So it's far in the background. That means that it's going to be kind of pretty straight across. And then we're going to continue on, right? So in the great grand scheme of things, this value right here, this darkness of this blue that we kind of have already established with this gradient, is being reflected in that water back there. Again, the painting's not about the water, so we can move on. Now we're going to grab this ground, this kind of ground plane that we're dealing with. We're going to put that all in. And this is where it's really tempting to try and put some of these houses in at first, all of this kind of stuff. Simplify. We're going to simplify. So I'm going to come in here, and we kind of have this nice, beautiful yellowy color down here. And so before we do anything else, oh, hello. Are you not working? Why are you not working? Just gonna give it a second here. Before we do anything else, let's come ahead and put this in. Right, and so already we're establishing some really big shapes. At the top, we have that middle, we have this kind of background, which is very, very nice. And we get to move on. So what I really want from this, again, this is where we're simplifying and then we're moving on. Not because our painting is going to be entirely simple, but where We're developing relationships. So the way that we see color, the way that we see value, the way we see light, it's all about the context of everything that's around it. So within this kind of painting, within landscape painting especially, we have the ability to be simple, to develop these relationships, and then go in for detail for what we believe is important. So there's some really interesting things that we're going to start to deal with here. One of them is called silhouette. Now, you've heard this word before, and it just means the outline of something. But the question is, how important is that silhouette? We're going to come over here and have a little look. So there are some really interesting things about silhouette, which you may not have considered. And the first one is, you remember that the Pokemon shows where in between ad breaks, they would say, hey, what Pokemon is this? And then they show you the Pokemon and you know immediately which one it is, even though they only showed you this kind of like black and white outline of what's going on. And our brain uses silhouette as one of its primary indicators of what is that, of asking the question of what is that? And so when it comes to painting this landscape we're painting, we can stop and say, where are we going to put our time and our attention? Where are we going to pull together? Because there's an infinite amount of information here. I can't do it all. What's the thing I make sure that I do? We want to always build these hierarchies of information so that we can put time into things that matter and don't waste time with things that don't matter. Silhouette is one of these. And there's a couple of things that we can do while we do this. So, we've got some examples of silhouette here, maybe a little bush. And in this, I'm kind of sequencing them from really basic that says maybe not quite as much as we want it to, like this big trunk here, right? And the first thing that you're going to come across when you're working with these is the temptation to make it very two-dimensional. And so we go from, we're just looking straight on and it's cut off at the top, to even just putting sort of this sort of round quality at the bottom, the round on the top. That tells us that this thing is round and that we can touch it and it gives it space. And that's what we want. Anytime we can have depth inside of our painting, choose depth. Anytime we can. We put some information on the side. We can even put texture in. You can paint texture without painting inside of what it is you're doing. And that's brilliant. That's amazing. And we want that as much as we can. Right, so for this one, having a little bush, it's very tempting just to put it there, but adding that bottom and then detail. And you can even communicate not just what is the object you're painting, but what's the relationship with what it's sitting on, by kind of how does it fit into everything that's below it. And so, yeah, this is, here's our painting. Okay, and so when it comes to this, we can do a lot of our work let's have a look, just by working through our silhouette. Again, we kind of want our values, it's our black and white quality. So let's see, it kind of sits down here, right? I'm gonna sort of pull that in. We've got these kind of basic trunks up here. So one of my favorite analogies, or maybe it's not even an analogy, it's something we don't consider when we're dealing with landscape paintings that can be found very helpful. I'm gonna talk about this while I just pull in this kind of overall shape. I'm gonna pull in the overall shape and then start adding the details. Yeah, one thing we don't often consider is that just like a figure drawing, you know, we have this focus when we're doing figurative drawing on getting the gesture. What's that mean? That kind of, it's where you see the overall lines, you see the movement. And then you work your way from there. Now, one thing you don't do when you're getting the gesture inside of a figure painting is you don't do every single little thing just as you see it. You want the movement, you want the whole thing. And so what we're doing right now is we're establishing the whole thing We're trying to find the things that matter, what matters to us. And just working through some of those things. We want that whole sense of feeling. And once we have the feeling, then we can disregard information that doesn't matter. And we can really focus on things that do. Right? And so this helps us to say that a tree is you know, let's work on this one. Instead of like going, let's see, it's got that little bit there, and we'll work our way through there. We might not end up with something that feels the way we want it to feel that way. And so we can come in here and kind of just, it's got that big one over here. So work our way down there. Right, continue to really focus on how is it feeling. And then the small details can fit into that kind of that big gesture. I'm going to add the small details. Because sometimes we don't want all the details, right? If I don't want your eyes to go back here, I'm not going to put details back there. We also have this big one in the front. Let's see yeah, okay. Just seeing how careful I need to be. Right, so we've kind of got this here. And we know that we'll come back and add whatever information, whatever details we want. Now, this is a big part of the idea of grouping, right? Because we look at the reference. The reference is just information everywhere. But one of the things we want to consider is that landscape painting, actually painting in general, it's not about replication, it's about communication. We're communicating something. And you can communicate to me via a textbook. And even though you're saying all of the things, at some point about 3 minutes in, I stop hearing all the things because I don't need to hear about every single detail. And in fact, if you do give me every single detail, I start to think that none of it's important, even though maybe some or all of it's important. But prioritizing this information we're communicating to say, hey, this thing is important. That's when you catch people's attention, right? And in order to do that, we have to deprioritize other things. All right, so we have a really nice thing going on here. Something very, very nice. And let me actually, I kind of just want to come in here and get the feel, get the sense for this a bit. This is our main point of focus. This is where we want to put the detail. And so this, for here, it's really important to get it right. For that guy back there, maybe not so much. So we're going to put some of this in here, really just focusing on how does it feel? How does the silhouette make me feel? Can I tell what it is just by the silhouette alone? Now, before we go any further, we had talked about mood. I had a lot of questions about mood. How do we get mood? How do we make things feel different kinds of moods? And so it's a complicated answer because it's a complicated question. Mood is a very insubstantial thing. It's important, but it's not made up of one quality alone. I want to talk about something that I go into in the landscape painting course a fair bit. And really that is about, here we go. That's about value keying. It actually ends up being really important. So you see this is actually, and it's an interesting landscape because there's a lot of stuff everywhere. All this stuff it's kind of hard to get your eye around, right? Even in the photo, it's kind of hard to see exactly what's going on. So we take this approach of pulling in the really important shapes. And so if this painting didn't have this really clear line coming right through the middle, some of these clear big shapes over here, it would be really hard to read. But we have that, and we've kind of got that established. Now, let's talk about what it looks like when we're changing the mood. And what is value keying? So value keying is the idea that instead of, say down here, we have all of our value sort of possible to us, all the way white to all the way black. Value keying says, actually, we're gonna use kind of a smaller version of that. A smaller version of that. So we're not going all the way to black, or maybe we're not going all the way to white. And the results are that we end up with something very interesting feeling. This often, almost all the time, it goes along with a change in color as well. And the reason isn't arbitrary. The reason is that the most of the time that we get to see these very different, it's the same picture, has a very different mood to it. And the most of the time that this happens is because there's wildly different atmospheric conditions, right? So something like this, on this big misty day, or maybe, you know, it feels dreamlike. This one down here, it feels like there's, I don't know, it's just dreamy. It's really nice. Very sunshiny day. Ooh, and that's really cool, right? It feels like there's fog everywhere. And so we might work our way into something like this. And the way we do that is by changing the value range so that our lightest lights are, let me see if I can get this again, all the way up at white. But our darkest darks, which is only a couple of spaces just here, is actually there. It's not all the way black. The majority of the stuff that we have is kind of up here in this top range. That gives it a mood, right? This one over here, this one, let's compare it to kind of that original. And the original is, oh yeah, right here. Right here, everything's a lot darker. And so, sorry, getting a bit lost in my stuff here. This one actually, we retain some of the darkness of what's down here, but everything that's in the light goes up. And that makes it feel like a really bright, sunshiny day, right? And here's sort of up a little bit more. Everything is keyed up so that the values that we're using are all the way up there. But that means that there's this really strong light and our eyes haven't quite adjusted to it yet. And it has a feeling with it. And that's part of the mood. And so this is really interesting. This is a dark one. It feels kind of more melancholy. A lot of our dark shapes merge and meld together. We kind of lose a lot of that information. And it might feel like nighttime. Like I said, these don't happen arbitrarily. These happen because the lighting condition changes. And because of those lighting conditions, you know how you feel at a sunset. Looking at a sunset, you know how you feel first thing in the morning when the sun is just coming up. It's not quite out yet, but you have this like really kind of unified value and color, right? You know how that feels internally, and you put that information on the way that we're dealing with values. Now it does change with color. I can't get these colors here exactly inside of this painting because those values are different. Let's have a look. If I'm dealing with a green and I have this big, deep, rich green, beautiful kind of stuff that we have going on here. If I make it lighter, we really are changing the feeling of the color as well. And so these things go hand in hand. Using limited color ranges goes hand in hand with having limited value ranges because of light. Again, it ends up being a whole nother conversation, but it is in fact very interesting. Yeah, okay, so that's the mood, and the question that comes to our painting, wherever it is, oh yeah, it's still in the same file, is, yeah, how do we want to deal with that? Let's put this back in. There we go. And so we can leave a lot of it light and bright, and that's going to give us a really nice kind of midday feeling. And that means that when it comes to looking at some of these details, we might not want to make them quite so dark. But let's come in. The focus of this painting is kind of the way that we're dealing with this. So I'm going to grab this color. It's warmer in the sunshine than it is in the shade. That's because the blue from the light above us is coming down and affecting everything that's in the shadow. So it's going to all have this slightly blue tinge. But really, it's not always going to come across as blue, but it is going to come across as cooler, which means that if I want to deal with this green in the sunshine, I want to make it warmer. which when it comes down here means I'm pulling a little bit more towards my yellows and my oranges. I want to make sure my value's right. We talked about the importance of that, and so we can play with this. Now we can come back and be wrong, right? And work back into it. Now, how do you deal with this detail? There's so much of it. Instead of working into every single leaf, which is going to leave us exhausted and no further in our painting, but also might not feel all that good inside of a painting, I'm going to be looking at these shapes that I see coming across down here like this. And all of these shapes that are kind of like these little C curves, or something kind of, if you feel like a nebula, and they have this light kind of around the edges. And so we're going to look into that. There's this kind of big, beautiful, that's a bit light for my liking. And so what we're doing is we're thinking around the forms that we're seeing. Thinking around these forms. And we'll come back in with detail later where we find it necessary. Again, we want to resist the temptation of detailing absolutely everything out. It's never quite going to feel as good as we think it is. Our goal is communication and not replication. Replication never quite gets us as far as we want to be. And so we're sort of working through this. We end up actually making a lot of shapes that emerge together. And this is something kind of merging shapes, working our way through something so that we really get a good feel of the big forms. And then our small forms, which is to say the small brushstrokes, help and inform the big ones. But we want big groups of things because number one, that's actually the way things happen in nature. And number two, it gives our brain a little bit more to hold on to in terms of being able to see that form, which is really good. All right, so this is close, right? Nowhere near close to completion, but close to communicating. Do we get to see this shape and feel where that sunshine's hitting it and feel like it's occupying space? That's a really good thing. So there's a couple of things that I want to share with you, kind of along those lines of grouping together and how we deal with grass, how we deal with the clouds. And it's going to feel like a non sequitur at first, but we're going to come back to it. You ready for it? I most certainly am. I love this. Now, this is a thing we talk about in the landscape painting course. Again, we go a bit more into depth and how does it apply to like a whole bunch of things. We call this patterns in perspective. Do you know that you can benefit from perspective being a landscape artist? You certainly can. But you don't need to deal with lines. You kind of just need to deal with some understandings. And understanding this, it's going to go further and further and further down. You can never quite understand this enough. Which is fantastic. This is the way most art works. You don't need to know some fancy thing. You need to know these fundamental ideas and have them sink deeper and deeper and deeper so that they just come out in your work. And so this is what it is, right? When we look down at something, maybe we're looking up at clouds and we see there's lots of clouds up there. Maybe we're looking down, we're seeing clumps of grass or these stones. And they're not square. We can't put them into real easy perspective, and they're not ellipses or anything like that. So they don't fit neatly into the ideas of perspective as we normally deal with them. However, if we were to grab this and sort of squeeze it, put it down on so that we're not looking above it anymore, we're looking across at it like this, right? We'll end up with something like this. Big, beautiful. There's a couple of things we can gain from this already. One of them is that these shapes, be they clouds, grass, clumps of grass, these shapes, the closer they are to us, which means we're looking down at them, we get to see more of these big shapes like this. The further they go back, the more these big shapes, whether they're perfect shapes or not, they're just clumps of random stuff, As they go back, they do this, and we start to see these kind of horizontal lines coming across here. You can see this everywhere in landscape painting. Let's take this a bit further. What happens if we give depth to it? Boom, we give depth to it. You can see this. It's just so satisfying. I want to do it a number of times. Right? It's essentially, I just copied and pasted the same thing, pulled it down, and just colored the edges in a little bit. Suddenly we get really good feeling something. They're like stones on the ground, right? And they feel right. More interesting things, more observations as they come in through here, is that we see individual things close up. Individual. There's space between them. We get to distinguish them nice and easily. As they go further back, we stop seeing individual things. We start seeing groups. This over here, you can make out the implication of the individual stone, but they're all grouped together. They're stuck together in the 2D plane. So that's really interesting, right? Really useful. We can take something like this, light the top a little bit, and now we really do have this big 3D feeling something. And this is all irregular things, but now they fit into perspective. Now they feel really far, they feel really good. Let's see. Here we go. There's a little bit of atmospheric perspective. The things that are closer to us have kind of this dark shadow, right? And the further away they get, the more light we get back in there. Again, we go into that more in the course, but yeah, you guys probably already know about atmospheric perspective. And here's another one. This happens in everything, right? This happens in clouds. There we go. So that and then it feels real. It feels like it's full of this kind of 3D space. Really beautiful things that can happen. And they don't require squares. They don't require boxes. They just require this understanding that as things go further back, they go from sort of looking up or looking down and seeing something in full, this depth. And then the further back it goes, the less of that you see, the more things are grouped together, the more kind of squished they're going to feel. And so let's take that back here, and we're going to apply that to a number of things. The first thing we're going to apply that to is the clouds. All right, let's get some... Actually, it gets pretty dark up there, right? This is where we start to make a detail call. Do we want to make that dark? We can do it a little bit. The more dark that we get that, there's going to be lots of contrast. This is something we haven't talked about yet, but contrast just means difference. It's the difference. The difference over any one small little space, whether it goes from light to dark. What's the difference? If it's a big difference, very light to very dark, it's actually going to take our attention. It's going to really take our attention. And so we've got to make a call, a judgment call. Do we want that to really take our attention? If the answer is yes, pull a lot of contrast in there. If the answer is no, then don't do it. You can have all the detail and leave it subtly. Right, and so you can see what we're just talking about. The further something is back, like these clouds, the more we kind of get these big grouped shapes going really horizontal. So we can work our way into this. And one thing you note about that little exercise that we just did with those patterns in perspective is that they really didn't have detail. They were 100% shape and a little bit of value just to give it a bit of context. And so we can really deal with these shapes and these patterns in perspective without adding detail and still let it have a profound impact on how our painting feels. Right? The more of this kind of stuff we know and that we can work into our paintings, the less details we have to put into our paintings to make them immensely successful. right? And so the closer to us, the more that these are individual objects. And here, we're going to put a little bit more detail in here. Another thing we do is we put like a little bit of detail, your mind fills in the rest. Like we say, it's about communication, not replication. And that means that we're dealing with the fact that people see, and our brains really do a lot of work with the things that we see. A lot of pattern detection. And so we can do just a little bit of work with these lights, recognizing that this the sun's coming down from this way, right? We always need to know where the sun is. Do a little bit of work with these lights, and it'll go a long, long way. I often think about this as a hook, right? Sometimes there's not enough information for your eye to really feel like there's something to hold on to. Just a little bit of detail helps gives your eye something to hold on to. Now, there's something else here. Remember when we grabbed these right here? Like this. And then we pushed them down, we gave them shape. And then we did this, we added a little bit of light to the top. And suddenly it feels three-dimensional. And we want to do this with the little kind of island or something back out in the back of our painting. And where just this little dark kind of shadow underneath gives it depth. Anytime inside of a painting we can add depth and dimension, we really want to. You can see it down here. There's this kind of the shadow right down here. Now the shadow's present in everywhere else, in all of these trees, but we don't want to do all that information and really kind of pull your eyes away. And so we know that without really much more else, we can do a little bit of depth just by pulling in that. And it goes a long way for our visual system to see what's going on and to add depth. I generally talk about the idea that we kind of have a primitive brain that doesn't always, we know something's happening, but our brain doesn't feel it until we kind of give it some of these primitive cues of depth. Beautiful stuff. Right, so we can do that and no more, and it already feels like there's a lot more to it, which is fantastic. Okay, I'm gonna come in here, and I want to deal with a lot of this, right? We still have a long way to go. And we're going to be doing a lot of grouping. So one interesting thing that happens, we talk about patterns in perspective, and that things get grouped as they go further back. They also go grouped as they wrap around, because you end up having the same kind of scenario. You end up having a very similar kind of visual scenario where the angle is moving around, and there's a lot more information stuck in this area than there is provided straight towards you. And so again, we get a lot more grouping as this tree kind of wraps itself around. Now, I'm not being too pedantic right now about the kind of colors that I'm using. Again, we talked about how value is maybe a little bit more important, and especially with something like this, where we're just kind of communicating, demonstrating, and I don't want to get sucked into getting it right in the way that maybe I would in sort of a more long form painting. But yeah, so even something as simple as this, we're already getting a lot of really good information as it goes through. Yeah. So let's kind of do this last one over here. And so, I mean, the question is, do we move more information around? Do we want to give it more? This middle one, yes, this is kind of where we want to start to focus our attention on sort of now. Maybe let's go ahead and give some more information here. So there's actually a darker spot across here. This comes from the form, right? The form of what we're seeing here is kind of something like this, where the light's coming in, it's hitting this plane, it's hitting this plane, and this is a bit darker across here. And we kind of want to get that in. That, again, this is value information. This is stuff that helps our brain really determine what's happening in the 3D world. So we can put that in here. We don't need to be pedantic about it. And then we have a sort of change in color over here. You can see now we're getting into the subtlety. Now we're getting into some different things that are happening and being able to really pull that in. But we know it's going to work. We know it's going to fit because we've done all of this kind of groundwork. All right, now we have this down here. And this is really nice, right? We're going to put this in. And this is lighter, and that means we're going to have a higher contrast sort of between what's going on here versus maybe between the tree and the grass here, which means our eyes are going to get sucked into this spot first. Which is really nice, given that this tree is kind of a central feature of our painting. Just kind of reestablish some of those details there. Okay, then we're going to come in here, and there's these kind of darker spots down there. Now this is where we can actually start to have a little bit more information that's not necessarily grouped. My suggestion is, you know, if you really want to sort of get good at landscape paintings, what we want to do is try to do something like this. Try exercises where you ask the question, how can I paint a field without ever painting a single blade of grass? How can I paint a tree without ever painting a single leaf? Now, there's going to be indication of grass, there's going to be indication of leaves, but how can I do as much work with as little detail as possible? Here we're going to start to pull in some of the background back into here. You know, we're really going to start to get into the feel of some more detail. There's some stuff back there, right? I want to get a little bit of it in. But again, we're playing this game like this is not the focus of the painting. But it kind of has a chance to overwhelm the rest of the painting. And so how can we put it in without really drawing too much attention? And so I'm making a cognizant choice right now that I'm not really going to paint houses quite so much. I might paint like this sort of little rooftop. But because I don't want anyone's attention to it, I'm not going to give too much attention to it. I kind of just want to make it feel like there's something back there and that you can sort of make up what you want about it. Kind of like leaving a little mystery inside of a story, not explaining everything. It's kind of like leaving a little mystery in a story and not quite explaining everything. You know, we can do that. We don't have to clearly describe everything that's going on. We just want to be clear about the things that are important to us. And so we talked earlier about one of the questions is how do we hide details? How do we have details that we come back to that we want them to kind of be a nice little boost at the end where you're like, I've been looking at this painting for a couple of days now and I only just realized this thing, or I only just saw it. And so let's do that in a couple of places. The first is up here. See these little bushes that are up here? I want them to be there, and they're going to be a little bit prominent, but they're not going to be as prominent as maybe these three trees. We don't want that, right? And so I'm going to come in here, and it's all about contrast. It's all about the difference in value, the difference in this black and white quality between everything. And so I can have, you can see it's kind of, some of them are sort of bolstered up against this tree. So if I grab this color right here, and I just make a little bit lighter, just a little bit lighter, I can start to put in these details. And in fact, if I do this, I actually have more of an ability to do more detail without it really stealing attention from the things that matter, just because there's low contrast. The values are similar. I'm going to do something similar down here. I'm going to grab this value of this big area, right? And again, this is the value of putting all these areas in, establishing relationships, and then building out from there. And get this, make our color a little bit darker, and then start to put in these bushes that are down here. I can do that. I can put a lot of information in without it really stealing your attention from this really big kind of overall view of things. I can even put a little highlight here. And what I want to do is grab again that background, give the highlight just a little bit from the background, so that even if I have a highlight, it's not a massive deviation. Now you do see that starts to really pull a little bit more attention. And the question of, is that a problem? That's really up to you as the artist. I'm probably more inclined to maybe give a couple of small indications, but not much more than that. We can get a bush to feel a little bit closer by pulling something like that in here. And you can see with this, right? I'm even going to grab here. I'm going to make it a little bit warmer, a little bit darker. And then I can start to put in a lot of really fun detail. And working like this, I can now fill this very simple, very clear painting with a lot of information, with a lot of subtlety. But if we do this without establishing relationships, we're quite often more inclined to just be throwing attention everywhere. It's kind of like listening to a piece of music and every single instrument's thrown all the way up to the top, right? Where in the end, you can't hear anything because everything's making a little too much noise, right? This is how we kind of start to think about paintings. We want a very clear indication of what is important. And this is given to us by contrast, the difference between our value, sometimes even the difference between our color. And then when we want lots of information in a place that's not important, in terms of this big kind of giant painting, down here it's not that important, but I still want really good stuff. So I can start to work in a smaller amount of contrast and get a lot of cool information in. without destroying anything, without destroying our big relationships. And this, my friends, is your beginner's guide to painting landscapes. All of these ideas, let's see, we talked about where to start. That start is just the really big sense of scale of everything. How to establish mood, how to use values to establish our mood. So for example, we can probably even pull back on our value here. Oh, sorry. If we want to make a slightly different mood here, kind of get a little bit more dreamy. Can make this lighter, and maybe even pull a little bit more into sort of the blues that we have back there. I'm going to do that this time around by just maybe something more like that. Right, and so now we get a little our values back there. Less attention goes back there. More space gets put between us and that back there. And then suddenly, we're gonna get some slightly different feelings into our paintings. This is a thing, obviously, you don't want to do at this stage. You want to do that back at the beginning when we just had our big plain shapes. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna stop right here. I'm gonna give you guys the chance to just put all of your questions that you had from this little guide down the bottom in the comments below, and then I'm gonna share kind of a time and a place that we're gonna do a live. If you can make it, you can ask your questions there. If you can't make it, ask your questions here, or do both if you have the chance. So you'll be nice and prepared. And then we're gonna finish this painting while we answer this all of these Q&As. So I'm really glad to be here. Thank you guys so much for signing up. And again, we have our landscape painting course that's starting very soon. And I hope you're able to make that. We're gonna sort of go into depth about everything. It's gonna be fantastic. So I'll see you there.